For 1,000 years, English basically incubated here on the island. And then two things happened within a very short time period which changed everything. The first thing was in the 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press, which then in 1476, then William Caxton brings to England. And this begins the beginning of printing, which leads to greater literacy and some other changes as well, as we'll see. The other thing that happens, of course, in 1492 is Columbus discovers America. We begin to have this expansion. And so England, and this time, and you'll see this sort of time period from the early modern period out, England as it moves, English as a language just sort of explodes off of this island where it was before. So you'll notice when you look at the history here, you'll notice a lot of things have to do with, for example, the Church of England, the Act of Supremacy, the Common Prayer, and a lot of things have to do with this sort of further severing of English from Rome and from the Church of Rome and from that language. And you'll notice also that a lot of the other sort of dates and important dates they have on here and events have to do with English sort of moving around the world in terms of the different places that it was settled. And it's really hard, I think, for us today when we think about English being a global language to think about this one place, this one island where it was, and how all that has changed. And so when when Queen Victoria could later say that the sun never sets on the British Empire, it's also true to this day to say that the sun never sets on the English language. English essentially, as you'll see, sort of takes over North America, spreads itself out throughout various places in Asia, particularly in India, and etc. Also note that the types of people who speak English change dramatically. Not only do we have all these settlers to the New World, and then English moving and being spoken as this sort of universal language in India, as it will come to be. But also note that you had the first African slaves arriving in North America. So suddenly you have people who aren't of British heritage, who aren't of English heritage, who aren't of Norman heritage, who suddenly are part of this group, who are bringing their own customs and their own linguistic background to them, and essentially adopting, whether by force, by conquest, by heritage, in whatever way, adopting English as a different language. Also note, in addition to all the religious changes that sort of result in a greater sort of establishment of English as a religious language, and therefore Latin as being less important in terms of how English works, notice how you start to have things like learning, like the Royal Society being founded, things like that, where English becomes also a language of international communication in terms of science. It isn't quite happening yet in the early modern period, but the foundation is being laid for that to happen. And another thing that I want you to notice in the historical events that go on in this time are the ways in which you start to have dictionaries being created because there's greater literacy. One of the things that students will find very difficult about doing the workbook is that in the Middle Ages, there is no set spelling for things. And so sometimes it's hard to say, like, what does this spelling mean? Does this mean this or does this mean that? Because, of course, writing is not language. And still, writing is not language, but people's literacy and widespread literacy begins to affect the way that we deal with English, as you'll see when we get to our very last chapters. Now, there's another major sound change that happens, not just a major sound change, but the major sound change. One thing you might have noticed is in the Old English excerpts, you couldn't read those at all. You just couldn't understand those. Maybe 10% of the words you might be able to figure out. And then the Middle English, you could read the words on the page, but if you hear someone speaking English, you couldn't understand that. In the modern English time, by the time we're getting to speakers like Shakespeare, you could hear it and understand it. It might sound a little strange to you. It certainly wouldn't be the way that you would speak in your daily life, but you understand it as your language. And the big reason that you can understand it is that there is a change in the vowels that we call the great vowel shift that occurs. And that's one thing. The way that the vowel shift is very important for you to understand when you're moving from the Middle English to the Modern English period. And so if you look at the charts of the great vowel shift, one way to think about this sort of movement of the vowels, for some reason which there's a lot of debate about, the position in which we say certain sounds moves throughout the mouth. And some have argued that, well, this sound comes in and pushes another sound out. Others have argued that, well, one sound moves and leaves a gap, but the other sound moves in to fill that. Whichever the reason, essentially, what happens is the vowels change positions into the positions that we're more accustomed to today. And so sometimes I've had students to try to imagine this in the mouth. Sometimes they think about like a reverse fountain or like a heart, where the sounds here down below, everything sort of moves up and then back down in this direction when you're looking at the chart. So I want you to really focus on learning the great vowel shift, all those other vowel changes, the short vowel, the long vowel changes, the diphthong changes, because to really understand what happens, all those historical changes that are going on as English is exploding off of this island out into the world, the vowels are changing very quickly too.